right. All right, Amanda.
All right. So today is the one day all semester I have had the hardest time with scheduling. So I decided I'm actually right in the middle myself of setting up a collaboration. So I thought this would be a really great, since I'm thinking about it and it's really on the forefront of my mind, I decided that's what I would talk about today. This was on my list I had a couple of faculty suggest that we talk about collaborations anyway. So this worked out really well, I think. So we'll talk about kind of effective collaborations, setting up collaborations, why they are good, kind of the benefits and all that. So I want to start with sort of the question of why collaborate to begin with. And there's sort of two things that we need to think about when we talk about collaborations. Sorry, I want to pull the chat up so I can make sure that I see when people ask anything. And one comes from granting agencies. So with granting agencies, they are specifically advertising that grants that have some sort of collaborative scope have a higher funding priority than grants that have no collaboration. And their wording for collaboration can really vary quite a bit. It can be principal investigators from the same discipline, from different disciplines within institutions. So you could have different disciplines within the same institution, multiple institutions, and even international groups that can collaborate with one another. So, you know, when we think about collaboration, I don't know, there's generally some underlying assumptions with what that might mean, and that varies, I think, between disciplines, but according to granting agencies, this is kind of what they're looking at. If you are a single PI writing a grant, that is less likely to be funded than even a dual PI grant, even if the PIs are among the same discipline at within your institution. So why is this? Why is it that granting agencies are giving collaborative groups a higher funding priority? Well, one of those reasons is because there is research out there showing that collaborative groups reduce this echo chamber effect. So the idea that we just keep doing the same things over and over and over again, we can broaden our horizons and get better, more long-lasting, kind of high-priority data out of that. So if we talk about just kind of I meant to put this, sorry, this is a little overwhelming. I meant to do these one at a time. I don't know if you guys have seen this, the illustrated guide to a PhD here, but I felt like this was a really good illustration of sort of what we're talking about here. But if we walked through this, there's this idea that as we've progressed through time, our knowledge base for PhDs has become too specialized. So if we sort of walk through this, we have like a circle here that contains all of human knowledge. The little bit of knowledge you gain when you finish elementary school, by the time you finish high school, you have a bit more. With a bachelor's degree, assuming that you've attended a liberal arts institution, you've gathered a whole bunch of knowledge all around, but also you started to specialize in some way. And then as you go into grad school, that knowledge is deepened. You read research papers that can take you to the very edge of human knowledge. And then at the boundary, you focus. And so when you're at that boundary, you focus for a few years. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. And until one day that boundary gives way, and that tiny little dent that you've made in the bounds of human knowledge is a PhD. And so when you back out and look at the big picture, your PhD looks something like this. So we can't forget, sometimes we focus so much that we forget in the big picture of things that specialized knowledge that we have really is tiny in the depth of human knowledge. Yeah, I really love this. I love the way that this walks through. But when we kind of reference this to collaboration, sorry. The other thing I wanted to say, the specialty of knowledge and kind of how that's changed. So one of the articles that I read, and I've got a slide at the end of this that has, I read so much on this in the last week or so. One of the articles that talked about this specifically gave the example of airplanes. And they were talking about how back in the Wright brothers days, the example that they gave was that the Wright brothers had enough general knowledge in order to build an entire airplane and finally make it work. But today, there is nobody at Boeing who is a generalized airplane scientist, right? They have so many people who specialize in engines alone, or in aerodynamics alone, or in landing gear alone. So there is nobody there who has enough general knowledge to build an entire airplane themselves. So whenever we're talking about our own research, we are all so very specialized that we tend to focus in our tiny little bubble and not look outside of that much, which really narrows the amount of work that we're able to do in a broad spectrum. So, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Resi bothers me sometimes. So, if one of the things that I really liked in this, one of the articles that I read, talked about publications and even outside of granting agencies, journals who are publishing articles that have various specialties amongst the authors. And those journals are becoming, those articles are becoming more and more numerous. And there are less and less articles today that are not collaborative in some way, shape, or form. And one of the articles that I really liked kind of categorized this as spiciness. And so they talked about, you don't want an article, you don't want a collaboration that's so spicy that the other knowledge is coming in way over here, right? Because that is too spicy, and there's no way in the grand scheme of things that that is going to work very well. Those don't get published very often. The ones that get published and do really, really well have some sort of overlap. Oops, wow, that's not overlap. Sorry, my mouse skills are awful. But there's some sort of overlap in the knowledge here that leads to a level of spiciness that the general population finds palatable. And those are the articles more and more that are having a higher length of life. So they are advancing the knowledge in such a way that has a long-term effect rather than something that's just really short-lived. So collaboration is becoming more and more important as we progress, in modern times. So outside of granting agencies, why else should we collaborate? Well, one of the reasons is that it increases our resources, especially at a small school like ours. We often have limited funds and limited resources. This could be as far as, it could be research specialties. We have a relatively small number of disciplines that are represented on our campus, and therefore we don't have people who specialize in everything. So bringing in different specialties from other institutions can increase our knowledge resources, as well as access to things like methodology or instruments that we don't have on campus if you're somebody who is working in like bench science, for example. But knowledge resources absolutely count in this as well. We can also get better feedback. We can start to see our research questions from varied angles rather than our kind of single-sidedness. And so when we're bringing in different people to comment on our research questions, even at the very beginning, we can start to ask new questions that we hadn't previously considered, and it can broaden our research scope even before any experimentation has been done. And then finally, you become more publishable. So when you've got multiple professionals reading your work, either in the same discipline or across disciplines or different institutions, you increase the likelihood that your very first submitted draft to a journal, for example, will be better than if you had written it alone. Not only that, you gain more access to professional agencies that you didn't previously have access to. So the example I have here is one of my collaborators is a gastroenterologist surgeon. So he's a clinician who does not have a PhD in bench research. He's a member of a professional society that does not ordinarily allow PhDs to be a part of their meetings. But because we were collaborating, I was able to submit an article or submit an abstract to this National Society of Colon and Rectal Surgeons, and then go to Los Angeles and actually present the data that we had worked on together as a PhD, even though they normally keep PhDs at kind of an arm's length. So we're able to, it was fantastic to sit in on that side of the science that I usually just don't have insight as to what clinicians are thinking on a day-to-day basis. So to be able to present my bench research to a bunch of clinicians, they had some really great ideas and thoughts that I had never considered from a basic scientist perspective. So if we bring in enough people, then we can gain access to professional agencies for presentations of our research that we wouldn't ordinarily have access to. So collaboration then is a very good thing for a lot of different reasons, but there are a lot of common problems and disputes, okay? So I found these two bison locking horns here. I thought this was a good one to put. The Office of Research Integrity, which is the government office that kind of handles all of this, says that, you know, even though this is a great opportunity for growth, there's also a huge opportunity for disputes and arguments. And they kind of categorize this into several different areas. They say most often disputes occur over data, over biological material, over the collaborative relationship itself, over the presentations of the research findings. I thought I had one more. The scope and direction of the research project. I didn't put that one on here. So when we talk about data, specifically, there are disputes over who has access to that data. If someone shares the data before the other collaborative partner was ready to share, how that data is managed, and how that data is analyzed. With the biological material, specifically in basic sciences, if you're sharing tissue samples, for example, or newly synthesized proteins or recombinant proteins or whatever the case may be, there's often arguments over who's going to pay for it and who manages it. The collaborative relationship itself, this is often more problematic, the office found, with interinstitutional collaborations rather than broader relationships, because people often fight over sharing research space. They fight over the structure and function of team meetings, about staffing needs. Again, if you're working within the same institution, there are often personnel conflicts that wouldn't normally arise outside of the collaborative relationship, and then personal and scientific conflicts. And then finally, the presentation of the findings. Most groups don't decide on the front end who the spokesperson is going to be. They also don't decide who gets to present the research findings, and again, on authorship. They don't have these strong decisions about authorships prior to the time, you know, when it comes to actually do the writing. So, backwards here. All right, so let's talk then about sort of how the stages of collaboration and how some of those common problems and disputes can be sort of solved along the way. Now, I'm going to click on this and it's going to get a little overwhelming because there are so many stages here, but I want to walk through them, and I promise I'm not going to spend a ton of time on any one. But we've got, these are the stages here. We've got conceptualization, the proposal prep, management, implementation, evaluation, dissemination of the information, and then finally conclusion or continuation of the project. So I'm not actually gonna go into any of these, but there's a few that I wanted to talk about that are sort of most important and kind of the places where a lot of these disputes can be solved even before they begin. And one of those areas is conceptualization. So this is the beginning of the discussions of the research idea. And the problems often begin with vocabulary, especially if you have research PIs who are from different disciplines or from different cultures. So I mentioned a little bit ago that some of these collaborations can be international and even regionally. I think within the US, a lot of the culture can vary and there can be some problems even laying out what this is going to look like on the front end. You may not have compatible working styles with the person that you are requesting a collaboration with, and you may have different assumptions to what collaboration even means, okay? So some of the solutions for that are to agree on the goals first. So it helps, one of the articles I read suggested is that you kind of lay this out and have each collaborative partner sort of write up what they think this is, and then have a meeting and sit down and be like, oh yeah, okay, and decide together what these look like. But with your research goals, you should have specific objectives in mind. Decide what approaches or methodologies you think will best help meet those goals. And then finally, develop a rationale as to why the goal is even worth pursuing. Is it worth the demand for resources? Collaborations can be expensive, and you've got to decide as an individual before you step into this collaboration if this is a research goal that is worth the time and money on the front end. Will it be relevant and significant to the various research fields? So if this is an interdisciplinary collaboration, each field needs to decide whether or not this is worth pursuing, and it's going to be significant to the field and then as a broader scope to society. And then finally, is collaboration even necessary? So could you do this on your own without actually collaborating, or are you just collaborating for the sake of saying that you're collaborating? And if that's the case, generally the best idea is going to be to not step into a collaboration that's not going to be necessary and worthwhile for everyone involved. So proposal prep is sort of the next step here. I don't know why pictures aren't showing up. I had some pictures here that are not coming up, but that's okay. Proposal prep really goes hand in hand with the conceptualization stage. And so this can kind of be worked on sort of at the same time. As you're developing the concept for your collaboration, you can use the proposal step stage to sort of firm up those things that you guys came up with during conceptualization. So you want to develop a proposal based on that information. And again, if each collaborative partner is coming to the table with those questions that we just discussed having been answered, then you guys can really narrow down your idea and say, okay, this is what we're going to do, step 1, step 2, step 3, and develop this proposal based on that information. So the questions that you want to ask then, why is this? During the proposal prep stage are what knowledge claims are being made by the research. You want to ask what strategies of inquiry will inform the procedures. So again, this might differ pretty dramatically from discipline to discipline or even research PI to PI. And then finally, what method of data collection and analysis is going to be used for each kind of step of this process. And the benefits of doing this is that this can almost always pinpoint areas of conflict before they arise. So if you guys have different ideas of how data collection is going to be done, or different ideas of how that analysis needs to be done, you all can talk about and talk that through at this stage rather than on the back end when all of the work has been done and now everybody's just fighting over how to handle it. This also develops a sense of ownership for all of the collaborative partners. If everybody sort of has a job and they have something that they know is theirs, then it can allow them more ownership over this piece. And so everybody starts to have kind of these areas that they feel are theirs, that they're contributing to this entire project. And it makes everybody feel more on board with everything that's going on. Okay, management is next. Now my pictures are showing up. And as much, this is kind of, I don't know, in my perspective, this is almost the worst piece, right? Like, I just want to get it done. I don't want to have to actually manage it, but somebody has to do it. Somebody has to manage this project. And the bigger it is, the more collaborators you have involved, the harder this is going to be. So generally, the person doing the managing is going to be the person who initiated the collaboration. But not all researchers are great managers. So that means that if you are the initiator, but you know that management is not your strong suit, during the development of this process, you have to work with your collaborators to figure out who the best manager is going to be. You have to acknowledge your strengths and weaknesses and then delegate appropriately. And sometimes this can be a little bit difficult to do, especially if you're the one that initiated the collaboration. You kind of feel like it's yours. But if you're not good at it, then you have to be willing to step back and let somebody else who has that strength on your team manage this properly. So the areas that have to be managed that have a high likelihood for dispute are the budget, especially if it's grant funded. People can argue very heavily over how the money should be spent. Formal agreement, so things like data ownership that we kind of mentioned already, material or technology transfer agreements. And for these two, it could be that your institution or your granting agency has specific rules about what these have to look like. And so you might have to bring in representations from your granting office or your institution to help navigate these things. For example, intellectual property, this can be really frustrating and kind of a difficult concept. So it could be for us, bringing David Wilson into those conversations on the front end would be great. So this needs to be sort of decided on the front end. And then as you walk through it, just make sure that you're continuing this discussion along the way. Like, hey, we talked about this. This is sort of where we are. This is what needs to be done, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, compliance. Ethics is a big part of that. So RCR training is one. Again, if you do not have an NIH or an NSF grant, but you're collaborating with someone who does, then obviously it's going to be much better on the front end if you have your RCR ethics training completed. If you are doing human subjects research, it would be a great idea for everybody from each institution to be certified in human subjects research before the research begins. That way, when you go in to do presentations or publications, you can check off that everybody on the team has been properly trained in those ethics procedures. And then again, animal care and use is another one. We do not have an animal care and use committee here on campus, but this is one where you can do even RCR training online, like city training or whatever, to at least get some sort of minimum level of animal research training done before you're trying to publish with people who have full IACUC committees on their campus. All right, implementation is the next one here. Essentially, this is when you kind of start hitting the ground running with your proposal. So you have everything ready to go. You know how everything is going to be managed, but then it's time to implement. So implementing is important for all people to realize that some tasks for completion may be dependent on other tasks being done. So this is sort of just a respect leads sort of idea, that you should be timely with the work that you have said you're going to do. Realize that some people may be waiting for you to complete your part of the research before they can start theirs. And then another part of implementation is to agree on the front end what data is going to be collected. I would argue that it is highly unethical to do a collaborative research experiment and then collect data outside of what you've agreed to collect for the collaboration. So you do the research, you do the data collection for the collaboration, but then you also have, hey, for my own idea, I've got my own research project, and if I collect this data that we're not using for the collaboration, I think that would be really great. Apparently that happens a lot, but I would argue that that's highly unethical unless you have cleared it with your collaborators. So just make sure that you guys are talking about what data is going to be collected on the front end. Evaluation is the next step. We can tie this in to kind of management as well. Again, on the front end, just making sure you have some sort of timeline. Develop places to regularly meet as a collaborative group to discuss the relationship, to discuss the data that's being collected, to determine what areas along the way are problematic and what's going well, and then try to make solutions to those problems as you go, rather than once you get to the end and then everybody's just angry. Dissemination, sorry, I'm kind of flying through some of these here, but dissemination of the information is, again, another place where a lot of these disputes happen. And so this can be circulating, distributing, or publishing any data related to the research findings. With dissemination, there are generally two targets that are talked about. One is disseminating information inside the collaborative group, and the other is outside of the collaborative group. And so as a collaborative group, you need to decide, you need to kind of be clear on the front end that you need to have a free flow of information within the group every time you meet. So this means even like good and bad news. You need to be able to share and work with each other on the data that is being collected. Disputes often arise when a part of the team shares research results before the collaborators are ready. So there may be other people on your team who say, we're not ready to share this yet, and then somebody goes ahead and steps out and does it. So collaborators need to agree on the process of dissemination of information, so how it's going to be approved, what information is going to be approved and shared, who is authorized to speak to share that information. If one person is just letting any old undergrad get out there and present their data, but yet another lab is holding that to whoever the highest collaborative person is on the chain of command, then there can be some big problems between those two groups. Deciding what audience should be targeted, and again, this is really critical if you're talking interdisciplinary research. If you've got psychology and biology, for example, are you going to try to really share most of that information with the psychologist or the biologist? Who gets preference over what audience gets the bulk of that disseminated information? And then make sure that you have clear descriptions on the free flow of information especially between the collaborators. That information should be shared back and forth relatively freely. And then some things to keep in mind. Granting agency requirements, again, it could be that certain granting agencies require sort of benchmarks. So they want you to share with them sort of where you are over a certain period of time. So it might be that you have one piece of the collaboration that is needing to share updates with their granting agency before the collaborative group has decided to disseminate this information. But there needs to be ethical sort of allowances met for people with granting agency requirements, and then authorship as well. This authorship should really be agreed on at the very first stage of conceptualization, but there's also a chance that things have changed as the project has developed. So if certain data doesn't come back as expected, and it's maybe not quite as important as had been initially thought, then it could be that whoever those authorship allowances might need to alter a little bit based on data as it comes in. And that's information that needs to be discussed at one of those regular meetings rather than waiting until it's time to write it up and submit it to a journal. And then finally, to conclude or to continue the collaboration. If your collaboration is designed really well, a conclusion will be naturally built in. And that is either because those specific markers have been met, because the data has been published, because the grant has been submitted, whatever the case may be. So the conclusion is naturally built in when X, Y, and Z are met, that were built into in the concept proposal stage. But once it ends, you can well, sorry, hold on, let's step back for just a second. It's also possible that once it ends, things have gone really, really well, and you decide to continue. And if you decide to continue, the continuation should start fresh with a new concept, a new proposal, and then to walk through as if it were a new collaboration. This should be relatively easy if you've walked through this once. A lot of the benchmarks and things with data sharing and all of those things are already built in. You already know what the requirements are for your group, and it's just a matter of sort of redefining the research aims and goals. But if it's going badly, you have places along the way, if you're following this process, to exit gracefully. The first place is during conceptualization. If you can't work with your group in such a way to develop a research concept without wanting to pull your hair out, then this likely isn't going to be a great collaborative partnership, because you can't even get things on paper together, much less to actually carry out the research itself. So you can bow out during conceptualization gracefully and then just end it there. Because it's likely that it's just kind of the writing on the wall that maybe this isn't a great idea. You can also bow out during implementation. If disagreements arise, or if a collaborative partner is behaving outside of the agreed upon concept, then it might be necessary to end the partnership sooner rather than later. And again, if you've developed the concept well, then you can point to, hey, we said we were going to do this and you're doing this, and if you're not going to agree to this, then I'm going to have to back out of this relationship. And again, that's a really professional, graceful way to end without everything just blowing up. And then finally, following implementation. So after the implementation has been done, it could be that the research findings are leading into different directions than were originally anticipated. So the collaborative team might need to be modified in order to bring in new collaborators potentially, or to reduce the partnership, to be like, you know what, we did this big experiment and the data is really going nowhere, so we're going to bow out. And that's perfectly acceptable. And so the effort may need to be either expanded or reduced based on the research findings after implementation. So that sort of finishes up a little bit earlier than I anticipated. I guess I talked really fast, sorry. Kind of what I had gathered. I've got, and I think we will make this link available to you guys. I have a list of articles that I utilize to pull this together. So if you guys wanted to read more about this, there are some really helpful, let's see, which one was it? The University of Nebraska has a best practices for developing collaborations. Oh, and this one as well, the How to Collaborate More Effectively, 5 Tips for Researchers. I try to bring in a lot of that into this conversation, but those are articles that have a very clear, like step 1, step 2, step 3, that can be really helpful to people who are going into collaborative relationships. And then the other thing that I put on here, down here at the very bottom, is we finished out, finally gotten the rest of the RCR topics for this semester put together. So we've got 3 left for the semester. On October 26th, Justin Briggs, who's the head of IRB, is going to come in and talk about human research and what that looks like here at Lipscomb. I'm so excited. Lonnie Cochran is going on November 9th to talk about the intersection of scholarship and teaching. I feel like that is really a fantastic place for us to discuss, especially here at Lipscomb, because that's a lot of what we do. Our scholarship is utilized in teaching, and I'm excited to have Lonnie come talk because that's her specialty. And then the last one for the semester, I'm bringing in Joe DeWeese, Emily Mofield, and Jan Harris, and we're going to do sort of a panel discussion on practices for effective student mentoring relationships and how to develop those relationships in an ethical, productive way to be there for our students, because I know how much we all love. It's one of the reasons that we're here is because of that hands-on priority that our students have. So I'm really excited about that. I also have a huge list for next semester. So it's just a matter of Hope and I getting together and coming up with dates and filling in for next semester. So I'm really excited about the topics that we have coming. So thank you guys. If you guys have any questions about any of this, comments, anything, just let me know.
Hey, great job, Amanda. Let me over my camera there. Yeah, great work. Thank you for your presentation. Collaborations are really, can really be a challenge. I've been blessed to be a part of several, and some of the things, you've stated really do come into play at different levels. And it's really important, I think, to be, relatively proactive and aware of some of the challenges that can come about. I'll be honest, several of the collaborations that have developed have not been very well thought out, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just in the moment, it's, hey, you're interested in this, I'm interested in this, let's see what we can learn as we study this together. And so sometimes they do happen pretty organically, and you don't get you don't have that moment where you work through some of the things that you're talking about, but at some point those things come up, and we've had discussions about authorship and planning those things out. And thankfully I've had really gracious collaborators, and we've kind of all made sure that everybody's thoughts and opinions are appreciated. We've also made sure that our students get appropriately honored. One of my collaborations is with some folks at Tennessee Tech, and they have a lot of students come through their labs doing some of the work. I have students coming through my lab, and we each have kind of had an opportunity to take hold and say, all right, this particular student really led this part of the project, so this is going to be a first author paper for them. And we've really had no major issues, thankfully. We just, like I say, we have some collaborators that are just really gracious and ready to see the project succeed, more so than worry about some of the particular details. So it definitely helps to find good people to work with. That that's another thing. And one of the cool things about our modern era is the connectivity. So I have a current collaboration, and a couple of my collaborators, one is in Canada, one's over in the Northeast. And so physically we've never all been together at the same place, at least not in several years, but yet we can still carry out a collaboration fairly effectively, even at a distance. So that's one of the blessings of our current era. So great work, Amanda. Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks. Yeah, I've had I'm in a strange situation, whereas I think almost all of my publications, not almost all of my publications, have been collaborative between Lipscomb and other institutions. I've never had one that has just been Lipscomb, and some of those have gone better than others, kind of in that same boat. I mean, I remember kind of had some horror stories. I had one guy one collaborator add in a bunch of people at the very last minute that I was not okay with. I was like, that really, it altered the scope of our research. And so there have been, but again, as someone who is very junior, you got seniority issues, to consider as well. I'm considered a very junior faculty. He was considered very senior. So you have to learn when to just keep your mouth shut and keep rolling as opposed to, when it's worth fighting. And having those really difficult discussions.
That's right. You learn to pick your battles.
Right.
Any other questions, comments?
So I thought I'd bring this up. By the way, I like the use of Prezi. That worked, I think, well. But that makes me think about, as you're talking about organizational skills and things like that. I use Evernote a lot to keep track of things. I use Doodle Poll to schedule meetings. Are there tools out there that different folks are using to either schedule meetings or to oversee projects? I know in the computer sciences, they're really great at this. There's several tools that are used, especially kind of in the computer science realm, around project management. It's not something I was trained in, right? As a scientist, that's not what we focus on, but it's definitely become a big part of what I do. So I'm always interested in if somebody has a particular tool for project management that works well for them, just to hear about that and, kind of their experiences with that.
I have two. Well, I have one that I utilize and one that I'm thinking about starting. And I think you guys in pharmacy use Quartzy. Do you not use Quartzy over there?
We had it for a little while. I mean, I could still technically log in, but I have never really, never really actually fully implemented it.
Quartzy is great for people who are having to maintain some sort of inventory of something. So it's not really great for data management or like project development, but what it is really good for is inventory management. So if you're doing a collaboration that is requiring shared resources, it's a great way to keep track of what resources are where. So you can even add in people who are not at your institution to log on to the web and be like, oh, does anybody have this on hand and where is it? So that you can talk about, oh, hey, I see that this is in your inventory. Could you send me some, or vice versa? So it's a really great tool for managing stuff. But another project management tool that I've been hearing a lot about, but I haven't tried to use yet, and I've been thinking about pulling it in, is called Monday. I don't know if anybody else has used Monday or how it's worked for them. But it's an online software project management tool. So if anybody knows more about that, I'm like you, Joe, I would love to know more. But it's one that I'm considering bringing in.
I've not used it. I have heard of Monday. That was one of the ones. The other two that I've heard of that I've not used myself, Airtable, Airtable, and then Notion are the other two project management tools that I've heard of.
I'm going to write those down.
Was that Notion as in N-O-T-I-O-N?
That, yes. Mm-hmm.
That's good.
I like that idea of kind of looking at some tools and resources as well to help.
Again, that's, most of us are trained in our discipline to do the work and not so much to manage or oversee the work. Trello is one that I've used as part of another project before, that some folks that I worked with, that was kind of their tool. And that has like a series, basically almost like Post-it notes on a board, right? And you move them along through various stages of the development. And that was a pretty neat tool. But like I say, right now I kind of, I have a whiteboard over here and I've got Evernote. Evernote has been really good just to kind of keep up with things, but it's not really some of the features it's not built with that kind of direct project management necessarily in mind, though I've been able to kind of use it for that. So it's kind of my to-do list tracking app.
Yeah, I have 4 papers in the work right now, so my whiteboard is in quarters. I'm trying to keep up with it that way. It's not ideal.
Anything else?
All right.
Great.
I think everybody's tapped out.
Well, I'm looking forward to the upcoming sessions for the rest of this fall semester. That's a great lineup that we have to finish out the semester. So thank you all so much for your participation, and we will see you all soon.
Bye, everybody.